The clock on the depot wall read 7:30 in the evening, and Irene Ford had not moved from that hard wooden bench since 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when the station master had first told her that the westbound train from Abilene was running late. 6 hours. 6 long, dusty, unforgiving hours in the town of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1878, with nothing but the sound of the wind kicking up loose dirt along the main street, and the occasional distant lowing of cattle being driven through the stockyards at the edge of town. She had a carpetbag at her feet, a small leather satchel on her lap, and a folded letter in her left hand that she had read so many times the paper had gone soft along the creases. The letter was from her brother Daniel, who had moved out to Dodge City the previous year to work at a dry goods store, and who had written to tell her that he was sick, genuinely sick, and that he needed her to come quickly. Irene was 26 years old, brown-haired and dark-eyed, and she had traveled from St. Joseph, Missouri, on her own, which was not something women did freely in that era without drawing comment. She had taken the first train west out of St. Joseph that morning, changed lines at a junction south of Wichita, and arrived in Caldwell expecting to board a connecting train to Dodge City within the hour. Instead, she had been met with a shrug from the station master, a heavy-set man named Greer with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, who had told her that the westbound line had been delayed due to a washed-out bridge somewhere between Caldwell and the Oklahoma Territory border, and that they were working to get it resolved, and that she was welcome to wait. So she waited. The depot itself was a narrow building of weathered timber, painted once in a dull red that had faded to something closer to the color of dried rust. There were 4 benches inside, a pot-bellied stove that was unlit in the summer heat, and a small window where the station master sat behind iron bars doing his paperwork. A few other people had been waiting earlier in the afternoon, a merchant and his wife heading to Wichita, 2 ranch hands catching a ride north, but they had all drifted away by 5 o'clock, either boarding earlier trains going different directions or simply giving up on the day and heading to one of the saloons on the main street. By the time the sun dropped low and the golden light came sideways through the depot's dirty windows, Irene was the only person left on the benches. She did not allow herself to cry, though she felt the pressure of tears behind her eyes more than once. She kept thinking about Daniel. He was 29, 3 years older than her, and he had always been the steady one, the one who wrote letters home on time and saved his money carefully and did not take unnecessary risks. The fact that he had written to ask for her specifically, that he had written in a shaking hand that was not quite his usual clean penmanship, told her everything she needed to know about how serious things had become. She read the letter again. She watched the light change. She listened to the station master shuffle his papers. She pressed her hands flat on the satchel in her lap and breathed slowly and told herself that the train would come, and that she would get to Dodge City, and that Daniel would be all right. The depot door swung open with a creak of hinges at precisely 7:45 in the evening. Irene did not look up immediately. She had heard that door open and close dozens of times over the course of the afternoon, usually followed by the voice of some passing cowhand asking about departure times before heading back out into the street. She kept her eyes on the letter and waited for the footsteps to pass. They did not pass. Instead, the footsteps came steadily down the aisle between the benches, deliberate and unhurried, boots striking the floorboards with the particular weight of someone who was not in a rush and had no reason to be. And then they stopped directly in front of the bench across the narrow aisle from hers, and after a brief pause, a man sat down. Irene looked up. He was tall even sitting, with the kind of lean, rope-cord build that came from years of hard outdoor work. He wore a dusty brown canvas coat despite the summer heat, trail-worn boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that he removed as he sat, holding it in both hands and resting it on his knee. His hair was dark, cut short but grown a little long over the ears from what appeared to be an extended time on the trail. His face was weathered in the way that faces weathered when a man spent most of his waking hours under the open sky. Not old, but marked, with lines around his eyes and a jaw that needed a razor. He looked to be somewhere in his early 30s, though trail life had a way of adding years to a face that the calendar had not yet put there. He settled onto the bench, looked once at the station master's window, and then looked at Irene with calm, dark brown eyes. "Evening," he said. His voice was low and even, and he said the word without any particular inflection, simply as a greeting. "Evening," Irene replied and looked back down at her letter. There was a silence, a comfortable one, or at least a neutral one. The man folded his hands over the brim of his hat on his knee and appeared to be in no hurry to do anything at all. Outside, a horse clopped past on the street. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted from one of the saloon's tinny piano notes carried on the warm evening air. After a few minutes, Irene said, without quite meaning to, "The westbound train is late." "I know," the man said. She looked at him again. "Are you waiting for it too?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the station master's window, then at the floorboards, and then back at her. And then he said something that stopped her breath for just a moment, not because it was extraordinary in its words, but because of the complete sincerity with which he delivered it. "I will wait too," he said. Irene Ford looked at this dusty, quiet cowboy across the narrow aisle of the Caldwell, Kansas Railroad Depot, and she did not know what to make of him. She did not know his name. She did not know where he had come from or where he was going. She only knew that 6 hours of solitary waiting on a hard wooden bench in a town she did not know had worn her down to a raw and honest state, and that those 3 words, spoken with neither explanation nor performance, simply offered like a hand extended, settled something in her chest that she had not realized was unsettled. "Irene Ford," she said, and held out her hand properly. He took it with a firm, brief shake, and there was something remarkably straightforward about the gesture, man-to-man almost in its directness, which she appreciated because she was not in the mood to be treated as a woman who needed to be handled carefully. "Ralph Holloway," he said. "Out of the Slashty spread 12 miles east, though not for much longer if the job I'm riding toward pans out." "Where are you riding toward?" she asked. "Dodge City," he said. It was, she would later think, the first of many coincidences that did not feel like coincidences at all, but felt instead like the careful and unhurried workings of something much larger than either of them. "So am I," she said. Ralph Holloway nodded slowly, as if this was not entirely surprising information. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small paper bag of peppermint sticks, the kind sold at general stores for a penny apiece, and held them out toward her without ceremony. "Long wait is easier with something sweet," he said. She hesitated for only a moment, then took one. "Thank you." "Yes, ma'am." She almost corrected the formality, but something in the way he said it, not with the dismissiveness that some men used when addressing women in that era, as though the word were offense to keep her at a comfortable distance, but with something closer to genuine respect, kept her from it. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Irene ate her peppermint stick slowly and folded Daniel's letter and put it back in her satchel, because she did not need to read it again. She already had every word memorized. Ralph Holloway sat across from her and watched the station master's window with no particular expression, occasionally rolling the brim of his hat between his fingers. "You have someone in Dodge City," he said eventually. It was not prying the way some men pried. It was simply the kind of question 2 people waiting together for an indefinite period of time might naturally ask. "My brother," she said. "He is ill, quite ill from the sound of his letter." She paused. "You work," Ralph said simply. "There is a rancher outside Dodge City named Aldous Bramley who is looking for a trail boss. I got word he is hiring experienced men. I have run cattle from Texas to Abilene 4 times. I figure that counts as experience." "It seems like it would," Irene agreed. "I also figure that getting to the interview matters more than not getting there," he said, and something in the dry pragmatism of his delivery almost made her smile. Almost. She was too tired and too anxious for a full smile, but the muscles at the corners of her mouth moved, which was more than they had managed in 6 hours. The station master's window slid open with a clatter of wood, and Greer leaned out with a look that suggested he was delivering unwelcome news and was not particularly sorry about it. "Westbound is delayed until tomorrow morning at the earliest," he announced. "Bridge inspection is taking longer than expected. 7 o'clock tomorrow, best estimate." Irene felt something drop inside her, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. Tomorrow morning. She closed her eyes briefly and thought of Daniel, and of the shaking handwriting in his letter, and of the fact that she had now been traveling for the better part of a day and was no closer to him than she had been when she started. "Is there anywhere in town to stay?" she asked, keeping her voice level. Greer gestured vaguely north. "Milligan's boarding house, 2 blocks up. Mrs. Milligan is decent enough. Tell her Greer sent you and she will not overcharge too badly." He slid the window shut again with the finality of a man who had delivered his piece and was done with the conversation. Irene sat for a moment, her hands folded on her satchel, recalibrating. She was practical by nature, the kind of woman who had grown up on the Missouri frontier before the frontier had been entirely tamed, and she understood that circumstances required adjustment and not despair. Daniel had survived this long. Another 12 hours would not be the difference. Probably. She stood and picked up her carpetbag. "Mrs. Milligan's boarding house," Ralph said, rising as well and settling his hat back on his head with an easy motion. "Same destination as it happens." "You were going to stay in town anyway?" she asked. "I figured on it when I heard about the bridge," he said. "I have been riding for 3 days. My horse could use a proper stall and I could use a bed that is not the ground." There was nothing at all alarming or improper about his tone. He was simply a practical man stating practical facts, and she found she appreciated that more than she could easily explain. They walked out of the depot together into the warm Kansas evening, and the main street of Caldwell spread out before them, its saloons throwing yellow light through open doors, its horses tied at hitching posts, its wooden boardwalks uneven with age and weather. Caldwell in 1878 was a cattle town, one of the southernmost shipping points on the Kisham Trail, and it wore that identity plainly. The streets smelled of cattle and leather and cook fire smoke, and the distant sound of the stockyards never quite went away. It was rough and loud and practical, and Irene moved through it with her carpetbag in hand and her chin level, because she had learned early in life that a woman who walked with uncertainty in cattle country was a woman who invited trouble she did not need. Ralph walked beside her, not too close, one hand loose at his side, and she noticed that he put himself on the street side of the boardwalk without making a production of it. It was an old courtesy, the kind that a man learned from a mother or a good example and carried quietly, and she noticed it. Mrs. Milligan's boarding house was a 2-story frame building painted white, or what had once been white, with a small porch and a lamp burning in the front window. The proprietress herself answered the door, a compact, brisk woman in her 50s with iron-gray hair pinned back severely and an apron that had seen years of hard use. She looked at Irene and Ralph with a single sweeping assessment. 2 rooms, Ralph said before Mrs. Milligan could ask. "Separate. $1 each, supper included if you want it," Mrs. Milligan said. "Supper is over in 20 minutes." "We want it," Irene said, because she had not eaten since early morning and her body was reminding her of that fact with some urgency. They ate at a long table in the dining room with 3 other boarders. A traveling salesman with a sample case, a young man who introduced himself as a land surveyor, and an older rancher who ate in complete silence and left as soon as he was finished. The food was simple and plentiful: beef stew, bread, boiled potatoes, and a thick gravy that was not elegant but was deeply satisfying. Irene ate with the particular concentration of someone who had been running on anxiety and peppermint sticks, and she felt some of the tension in her shoulders begin to ease as the warmth of the food settled through her. Ralph ate steadily and without ceremony, and he talked easily with the salesman about the trail north and with the surveyor about land prices in the western part of the state. And Irene listened to him talk and noticed that he was the kind of man who asked questions and then actually listened to the answers. It was not a common quality, and she filed it away without attaching too much significance to it. After supper, they sat on the small porch because the evening had cooled and the air was clean, and the stars over the Kansas plains were extravagant in their abundance, the kind of sky that existed only far enough from cities that the darkness was genuine. "How long has your brother been in Dodge City?" Ralph asked. He had a cup of coffee that Mrs. Milligan had provided, and Irene had a cup of the same. "Just over a year," she said. "He went west to work for a dry goods merchant named Cowboy. He sent good letters home for most of the year. And then about 2 months ago the letters started getting shorter, and then about a month ago I could tell from the handwriting that something was wrong, and then 3 weeks ago I got the letter that told me plainly." "What does he have?" "He did not say exactly. He said he had been feverish on and off for months and that the doctor in Dodge City said it was a wasting sickness and that rest was needed." She paused. "Daniel is not a man who rests easily. He has always worked too hard." "Brothers are like that," Ralph said. "Do you have brothers?" she asked. "Two," he said. "Both back in Texas. Both stubborn as fence posts." He said it with the kind of warmth that made the criticism meaningless. "One of them is ranching near San Antonio. The other is working a copper mine near El Paso. We do not see each other much. The land makes it difficult." "The land makes everything difficult," Irene said. "And interesting," Ralph said. "Sometimes at the same time." She looked at him over her coffee cup. In the lamplight from the window, his face was easier to read, not soft exactly, but more open than it had been in the stark light of the depot. He had a directness to him that she found steadying, because she was a direct person herself and had always found evasion exhausting. "Why are you going to Dodge City for this particular job?" she asked. "There are ranches between here and there. Surely you could find a trail boss position closer to home." Ralph was quiet for a moment, looking out at the street. "The Slashdee was sold," he said. "The owner died in the spring and his wife did not want to keep it running. The new owner brought his own men. I have been on the trail since April, picking up work where I can find it, and I heard about Bramley's operation from another foreman I know. It is supposed to be a solid outfit. Good cattle, fair wages, honest management." "And you want to settle somewhere," she said. It was not a question exactly. He looked at her with mild surprise. "Yes," he said. "I am 32 years old and I have been moving since I was 17. I would like to know where I am going to wake up in the morning for more than a month at a stretch." There was something unexpectedly vulnerable in that statement, delivered in his plain, quiet way, and Irene thought about it after she went up to her room for the night. She thought about it while she unpacked her small necessities from her carpetbag and washed her face and sat on the edge of the narrow bed in the yellow light of a single candle. She thought about a man who had been moving since he was 17 and wanted to know where he was going to wake up. She understood that feeling in a different way, through different circumstances, but she understood it. She blew out the candle and slept better than she expected to. In the morning she came downstairs to find Ralph already at the dining table with Mrs. Milligan's coffee and a plate of eggs and bread, and he stood when she came in, which was another one of those quiet courtesies, and she sat across from him and ate while they talked about the day. "Train should be on time," he said. "Greer posted a notice on the depot door, 7 o'clock departure." "Good," she said, and the relief of it moved through her like a warm current. They walked back to the depot together through the early morning, the town just beginning to stir, men leading horses from livery stables, a cook at the back of a restaurant flinging dirty water from a bucket into the alley, the smell of coffee and wood smoke, and horses filling the cool air. It was a different Caldwell from the one she had arrived in the previous day, or perhaps it was simply that she was seeing it from a different angle, with less despair in her eyes. The depot filled up as 7 o'clock approached. The westbound train came in at 10 minutes past 7, which in that era and in that part of the world was practically on time. A great black locomotive breathing steam into the morning air with a sound like the earth itself clearing its throat. Irene picked up her carpetbag and felt the urgency of the previous day return in a rush. She was going to get to Daniel now. She was actually going. Ralph appeared beside her on the platform as the passengers began to board, and she turned to say something appropriate, something grateful for the company and the peppermint stick and the evening conversation, and found herself looking at him in the clear morning light. And what she saw was a man who was watching her with an expression she could not quite name, quiet and steady and careful, as though he was taking in something he wanted to remember. "Safe journey," she said, and it came out more formal than she intended. "Same to you," he said, and then as she turned toward the car, he said, "I hope your brother recovers quickly." "Thank you," she said. "I hope you get the job." She boarded the train and found a seat by the window, and when she looked out she saw him on the platform, settling his hat back on his head, his carpetbag at his feet, about to board the same car. Their eyes met through the glass for a moment, and he gave her a brief nod, and she turned to face forward and felt her heart doing something she did not give it permission to do. It was a day's journey from Caldwell to Dodge City, roughly 120 miles west along the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe rail line, and it should have taken no more than 5 or 6 hours under normal conditions. The train moved through flat, windswept prairie, the same grass and sky repeated endlessly, broken occasionally by the dark geometric shapes of cattle herds being driven north, and the distant glinting shapes of creeks and dry riverbeds. Ralph sat 2 seats ahead of her in the same car, which she was aware of in the way she was aware of the weather, not intrusively, but as a consistent background fact. At some point near noon he turned and offered her another peppermint stick, passed back along the aisle, and she took it and felt absurdly pleased about something so small. About 3 hours into the journey, a woman 3 seats back began to weep quietly and persistently, clearly distressed. Irene turned to look and saw a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, with a basket on her lap and a face reddened from crying, sitting completely alone and staring at the floor. The woman beside her on the seat had moved away, as people sometimes did when a stranger's grief made them uncomfortable. Irene looked at the young woman for a moment, and then she picked up her satchel and moved back through the car and sat down next to her. "Are you all right?" she asked. The young woman, her name turned out to be Clara. Clara Ames was traveling to Dodge City to meet a man she had agreed to marry after corresponding with him for 6 months through a matchmaking arrangement. She had sold almost everything she owned in Indiana to make the trip, and she had just received a letter at the Caldwell station, passed to her by the station master there, informing her that the man in question had died of a fever 2 weeks earlier. "I have nowhere to go," Clara said, not dramatically, but with a flat factual despair that was somehow worse than drama. "I spent almost everything I had to get here." Irene put her hand on Clara's arm and said nothing for a moment because nothing was the appropriate thing to say first. Then she said, "You are going to Dodge City. There is work to be found in Dodge City, and you will find your footing." "You sound very certain of that," Clara said, looking at her sideways. "I'm not certain at all," Irene said honestly. "But I find that sounding certain helps until things become actually certain. Do you have any skills? Can you cook, sew, keep accounts?" Clara blinked. "All of those, yes." "Then Dodge City will have use for you," Irene said. "And I will help you find it if you like. I know at least one merchant in that town." She stayed with Clara for the rest of the journey, talking quietly, going through the practical options available to a young woman alone in a western cattle town in 1878 with limited funds and no immediate connections. And in the course of that conversation, she watched Clara's shoulders slowly come down from her ears and her breathing steady, and felt a quiet satisfaction in having done something useful with the afternoon. When she finally came back to her original seat, she found that Ralph had moved to the seat directly across the aisle from her original one, and that he was reading a newspaper he had acquired somewhere, or pretending to. He looked up. Settled, he asked. As much as possible, Irene said. She is in a difficult situation. I heard, he said, and folded the newspaper. What did you tell her? That Dodge City would have worked for a woman who can cook and sew and keep accounts, Irene said, sitting down. And does it? Certainly, Irene said. I am not in the habit of lying to frighten people. Ralph looked at her with that quiet, assessing look she was beginning to recognize. No, he said. I do not think you are. He paused. You are practical. I had to become so, she said. My father died when I was 14. After that, it was mostly Daniel and me managing the household until he went west. What does your mother do? She died when I was born, Irene said simply. My grandmother raised us until I was old enough to take over. Ralph did not offer condolences with the rote sympathy that people sometimes performed in response to such information. He simply nodded with a kind of serious respect for the facts as she had stated them. She appreciated that more than she could say. Your father, she asked. Died when I was 17, he said, which is why I started moving. There was a cattle drive leaving San Antonio, and I needed wages and I got on it, and I have been in the cattle business ever since. Has it been good to you? He considered this with genuine care, as though the question deserved a real answer rather than a convenient one. It has been honest, he finally said. I cannot always say the same for the people in it, but the work itself has been honest. You know what you have done at the end of a day. The cattle are either where they are supposed to be or they are not. There is something to be said for that kind of clarity, Irene said. I think so, he agreed. Dodge City came into view in the late afternoon. A collection of buildings sprawled along the Arkansas River under a wide sky that had gone the color of hammered copper in the declining sun. Even from the approaching train, it was unmistakably a cattle town, with the smell of stockyards arriving before the buildings themselves were fully visible, and the sound of activity rising above the mechanical noise of the locomotive as they drew into the station. The Dodge City of 1878 was at the height of its cattle shipping days, and that meant it was loud and crowded and bristling with a particular energy that was somewhere between commercial and violent. A place where enormous amounts of money changed hands in very short periods of time, and where the law, in the person of the town marshal and his deputies, was in constant negotiation with the chaos that the cattle trade brought in its wake. Irene had been told about it by Daniel's letters, but the reality of it, the sheer density of voices and smells and motion, was something the letters had only approximately conveyed. She stepped down from the train with her carpetbag and looked at the platform and the street beyond it and felt the particular mix of anxiety and determination that had been her traveling companion all day. Clara Ames stepped down beside her, still pale but composed, and thanked Irene 3 times in rapid succession. Ralph stepped down last and scanned the street with practiced eyes before looking at Irene. Where is your brother staying? The letter had an address on Walnut Street, she said. He boards at a place called the Kenyon House. I know where that is, Ralph said, with the ease of someone who had passed through Dodge City before. I will take you. You do not need to, she started. I know, he said simply. I will take you anyway. She did not argue, partly because she was genuinely uncertain of the streets and partly because, she admitted to herself honestly, she did not want to do this next part alone. Seeing Daniel for the first time since his letter, seeing how sick he really was something she had been building up to all day, and the quiet steadiness of Ralph Holloway at her elbow was, against all her practical sensibilities, a comfort she was not willing to refuse. They left Clara at the station with a recommendation to speak with the manager of the Dodge House Hotel about laundry and kitchen work, and with Irene's promise to check in on her within the week. And then they walked south through the organized chaos of Dodge City's Main Street. Front Street in Dodge City in 1878 was a spectacle and a warning simultaneously. There were saloons and dance halls and dry goods stores and barber shops all crammed together in a strip of wooden buildings that looked as though they had been erected in a hurry, which most of them had been, and the boardwalks were crowded with cowboys coming in off the trail and merchants and gamblers, and the various other types that cattle money attracted. It was rough and alive and entirely uninterested in anyone's personal circumstances, which was, in its way, a kind of freedom. They turned off Front Street and the noise receded to a background hum, and the streets became quieter, with houses and rooming establishments set back from dusty lanes, and cottonwood trees throwing long shadows in the late afternoon light. The Kenyon house was a two-story wooden building with a garden that someone had tried to maintain against the Kansas summer, mostly successfully, with zinnias in a row along the front path and a kitchen garden visible through a side gate. Irene knocked. A heavy-set woman in her 40s answered Mrs. Kenyon, who had the worn, capable look of someone who had been running a boarding house for a long time and had seen most things that boarders could do. She took one look at Irene's face and stepped back from the door. "You must be Daniel's sister," she said. "Is he?" Irene started. "He is alive," Mrs. Kenyon said quickly. "He is better today than he was last week, in fact, but he is in bed and he has been." "Come in, come in." Irene came in. Ralph stayed at the door. "I will wait," he said, and there were those words again, spoken just as simply as they had been the first time. Irene went up the stairs to the second floor, following Mrs. Kenyon, and was led to a room at the end of the hall that smelled of camphor and dried herbs and the particular staleness of a sick room. Mrs. Kenyon knocked softly, opened the door, and stepped back. Daniel Ford was propped against pillows in a narrow iron bed, thin in a way that frightened her, with hollows under his eyes and a pallor that was not natural for a man who had always been robustly dark-complexioned. But his eyes were open, and they were clear, and when he saw her they filled with something that was not quite tears but was close enough to them. "Irene," he said, and his voice was rough but warm. She crossed the room in 3 steps and sat on the edge of his bed and took his hand, which was thin and cool, and held it in both of hers, and she did not speak for a long moment because her throat had decided to stop working properly. "You came," he said. "Of course I came," she said, and her voice came out steady, which she was proud of. "What in the world have you done to yourself, Daniel Ford?" He managed a faint smile. "The doctor says it is a prolonged fever combined with the effects of overwork and poor eating habits. He says if I rest properly and eat what Mrs. Kenyon puts in front of me, I will be on my feet again in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, she repeated. He is confident, Daniel said. And I am feeling better than I have in a month. She sat with him for 2 hours, talking in the quiet way that siblings who have been close all their lives talk, moving between news and memory and the comfortable shorthand of a shared history. He asked about the journey and she told him about the depot delay and the night at Mrs. Milligan's, and when she mentioned Ralph Holloway, he looked at her with the particular attention of a brother who had always paid close notice to anything connected to his sister's life. "Who is he?" Daniel asked. "A cowboy heading to Dodge City for work," she said. "He sat with me in the depot when I was waiting alone, and he has been company on the train." "And is he downstairs waiting for you now?" "He said he would wait," she said, and heard how it sounded only after the words were already out. Daniel's expression was difficult to read precisely, but she saw something in it that was not concern. "Go down and tell him I thank him for looking after my sister," Daniel said. "And Irene?" "Yes. Come back tomorrow," he said. "Come back every day. Having you here will help more than any medicine." She squeezed his hand and stood. "I will find lodgings and I will be back in the morning," she said. "And you will eat whatever Mrs. Kenyon brings you." "Yes, ma'am," he said with the ghost of his old humor. She went back downstairs to find Ralph on the front porch, sitting on the step with his hat on his knee, watching the street as the last of the daylight faded. He looked up when she came through the door, and she saw the question in his face without him having to ask it. "He is alive," she said. "He is genuinely improving. The doctor says 6 weeks of proper rest." She sat down on the step beside him, which was not the most proper arrangement in 1878, but she was past caring about propriety at this particular moment. "He is thin and he has frightened me, but he is going to be all right." Ralph said nothing, but she felt the small exhale of relief that moved through him and realized that he had been genuinely invested in the answer and that this affected her more than she expected. "Thank you," she said, "for walking me here." "It was no trouble at all," he said. Then quietly, "I am glad he is going to be all right." They found separate lodgings in Dodge City that evening, Irene at a respectable boarding house recommended by Mrs. Kenyon, on a quieter street south of Front, and Ralph at a cowhands hotel near the stockyards that was utilitarian and cheap. He escorted her to her boarding house before heading to his own, and at the gate they stopped, and she looked at him in the blue dusk. "I suppose you will call on the Bramley Ranch tomorrow," she said. "That is the plan," he agreed. "I hope it goes well for you," she said, and she meant it with a sincerity she could feel in her chest. "I hope your brother continues to improve," he said, and she believed he meant that too. There was a pause, the kind that exists between two people who have suddenly run out of organized things to say. He turned his hat in his hands. "Dodge City is not a large town," he said. "No," she agreed. "I imagine we will see each other," he said. "I imagine so," she said. He nodded, settled his hat, and walked back up the lane toward the street, and she watched him go and stood for a moment at her gate in the evening air before going inside. She went to see Daniel the next morning, and found him sitting up in bed eating porridge, which Mrs. Kenyon reported as a significant improvement over the previous week's complete loss of appetite. He was still thin and pale, but the clarity in his eyes was unmistakably better, and he talked more than he had the previous evening, asking her about St. Joseph and the people they had known and the news she carried. She visited him every day for the next 2 weeks without exception. In the mornings she would bring him the Dodge City Times and read to him from it when his eyes got tired, and in the afternoons she would sit with him and they would talk or play cards, or she would help Mrs. Kenyon with the preparations of Daniel's particular foods, because she had always been a good cook, and because cooking for someone gave her hands something useful to do while her mind worried. On the third day in Dodge City, she ran into Ralph Holloway at the general store on Front Street, where she had gone to buy writing paper and a new pen nib and some peppermint drops for Daniel, who had expressed a desire for them. Ralph was at the counter paying for supplies with a focused expression, and he turned when she came through the door, and his face changed in a way that she chose to classify simply as pleased. "How is your brother?" he asked, stepping aside to let her approach the counter. "Better," she said, and could not help the smile that went with the word, because every time she said it she felt the relief of it fresh. "And you? The Bramley Ranch." "I met with Aldous Bramley yesterday," Ralph said. "He offered me the trail boss position on the spot. I start next week." "That is wonderful news," she said, and meant it. "It is good news," he agreed with characteristic moderation. "The job is real and the wages are fair and the outfit appears to be what I was told it was. So yes, good news." She bought her writing paper and her pen nib and her peppermint drops, and he carried her paper bag for her out to the boardwalk without asking, simply picking it up as a natural gesture, and they stood in the morning sunlight on Front Street. "I was going to get breakfast," he said. "The Dodge House dining room. Would you join me if you have not eaten?" She had not eaten, as it happened, having left too early in her eagerness to get to Daniel, and she said yes without deliberating over it, which surprised her a little and pleased her considerably more. The Dodge House dining room was the best table in Dodge City, which was not saying a great deal by comparison with what existed further east, but it was clean and the food was cooked with some care, and the coffee was genuinely good, which Irene had learned to value above almost everything else during her traveling years. They sat across from each other at a table by the window and ordered eggs and biscuits and drank their coffee, and the conversation moved the way good conversations move when two people are getting to know each other and finding the territory interesting. She learned that he had grown up on a small ranch near San Antonio, the second of 3 boys, that his father had died of a chest ailment before any of them had finished growing, that his mother had remarried a steady man named Hewitt who was kind to all three boys and had helped the two younger ones through school. She learned that Ralph could read and write well, having been educated through the 8th grade in a schoolhouse outside San Antonio, and that he read when he could get books, which on the trail was not often. She learned that he had a dry and underplayed sense of humor that surfaced in unexpected moments, and that he was very good at asking questions, and that he could sit in comfortable silence without needing to fill it, which she considered a rare and valuable quality. He learned that she had run a household from the age of 14, that she had been briefly engaged at 20 to a man named Foster who had ultimately decided he wanted to go to California, and that she had decided she did not, and that the parting had been sad but not devastating. He learned that she had spent the last 6 years working as a seamstress and dressmaker in St. Joseph, which was skilled and independent work that had given her a reasonable income and a degree of freedom unusual for a woman of her time and circumstance. He learned that she had strong opinions about the injustice of the fact that women in Kansas could not vote, which was a subject that had been debated in that state with unusual energy in the preceding decade, and that she was not shy about stating those opinions. He listened to them without contradiction, and she observed that he neither patronized her by agreeing too quickly nor dismissed her by deflecting. "What do you think?" she asked directly, when she had finished saying what she thought. "I think," he said slowly and carefully, "that I have seen cattle drives where the decisions of one man affected 40 men, and if any of those 40 men had been women they would have had no less right to a say in those decisions, so I do not see why voting should be different." She stared at him for a moment. In 1878, in a cattle town in Kansas, that was not a common position for a man in dusty trail clothes to articulate. "You mean that," she said. "I generally say what I mean," he said mildly. "It is less complicated." She looked at him across the table and felt something shift, something deeper than the companionship of the waiting depot and the shared train journey, something that had its roots in that moment but had been growing quietly ever since. She did not say anything about it, but she felt it. Over the following days they fell into a pattern that neither of them had discussed or arranged, but which simply happened as naturally as weather. She would visit Daniel in the mornings, and in the late mornings or around the noon hour Ralph would appear at Mrs. Kenyon's to check in, at the general store when their errands coincided, at the small park of cottonwood trees by the river where she sometimes walked to clear her head. He was never intrusive. He never appeared in a way that felt presumptuous or that put her in a position she had not chosen. He simply appeared, with the same easy manner and the same unhurried quality, and they would walk or sit and talk, and each conversation left her knowing more of him and wanting to know more still. Daniel noticed. Daniel had always been perceptive about his sister, and even from his sickbed, thin and limited by the requirements of his recovery, he was paying attention. On the 10th day of her stay in Dodge City, while she was reading to him from the newspaper and he was supposed to be resting, he said without preamble, "You like him." She kept her eyes on the newspaper. "He is good company," she said. "Irene," Daniel said. She lowered the newspaper. He was looking at her with the specific expression of a brother who is about to say something honest and knows that the honesty may be unwelcome, but is going to say it regardless. "You like him," he said again with quiet certainty. "He is a good man," she said. "Those are two different statements," Daniel said. "Good men exist in some quantity. There are perhaps 40 good men within a mile of us right now. You do not look the way you look when Ralph Holloway comes to the door when any of those other 40 good men knock." She folded the newspaper very precisely along its existing crease. "What way do I look?" she said. "Like yourself," Daniel said, "which is the thing you stopped doing for a long time after Foster and which I have been waiting a considerable time to see again." She sat with this for a long moment. The room was quiet. Outside, a wagon went by on the street, and somewhere in the house Mrs. Kenyon was doing something industrious in the kitchen. "He is taking a job as trail boss on the Bramley Ranch," she said. "He will be here for the foreseeable future." "And you are here for 6 weeks at least," Daniel said. "I am here for as long as you need me," she corrected. "I am healing well," he said, "which means that by your 3rd week here I will be getting up and resuming my life, and by your 6th week I will be telling you to go home because you are hovering." He paused. "Unless you have a reason not to go home." She stood up and smoothed her skirt and picked up the newspaper. "Rest," she told him firmly. "The doctor said rest." "The doctor did not say anything about stopping thinking," Daniel said, and closed his eyes with a small, satisfied expression that she found deeply irritating and, somehow, deeply comforting. That evening she took a longer walk than usual along the riverbank, where the cottonwood trees grew tall and the Arkansas moved slow and muddy through its wide channel, and the evening was cooler by the water than anywhere else in the town. She thought about Daniel's words, and about the careful honesty that had always characterized their relationship, and about the fact that Daniel, who had known her all her life and who could read her face the way she could read a page of text, was telling her plainly what he saw. She thought about Ralph, which she had been doing with increasing frequency over the past several days. She thought about the ease of him, the steadiness, the quiet respect he offered without performance or calculation. She thought about the way he said what he meant and meant what he said. She thought about his voice, low and even, and the way he looked at her directly, without the sideways assessment she had learned to recognize as the look of a man wondering what he could get away with. He looked at her like a person. It seemed like it should not be remarkable, but in her experience it was. She was standing at the edge of the riverbank watching the water when she heard footsteps on the path behind her, and she turned. And of course it was him, because Dodge City was not a large town, and because her life in recent days had apparently decided that whatever needed to happen between herself and Ralph Holloway was going to happen on its own schedule regardless of her opinions about the proper management of her emotions. He stopped a few feet away, hat in hand, and looked at the river and then at her. "I was coming to see if Mrs. Kenyon knew where you had gone," he said. "She said the river walk." "She was right," Irene said. He came to stand beside her at the edge of the bank, and for a while they simply looked at the water, which was the color of old copper in the evening light, and moved with a slow, unhurried authority that she found calming. "I received a letter today," he said eventually, "from a friend in Texas, a man I worked with on the first drive I ever ran 12 years ago. He is writing to tell me his wife died in the spring." He paused. "He has 4 children and a ranch, and he is writing to tell me that he does not know what to do without her, that the ranch and the children are continuing but that the living of life has gone out of it." "I am sorry," she said. "It made me think," he said. He turned his hat in his hands. "I have been on my own for a long time. I have built a working life, and it is a good working life. But I read that letter and I thought about what it would be like to have built a life alongside someone rather than simply in parallel with the fact of other people's lives." He stopped. He was looking at the river. "I do not know how to say this without it sounding either presumptuous or foolish, and it may be both." "Say it plainly," Irene said. Her voice was quiet and entirely steady. "You said once that you generally say what you mean because it is less complicated." He looked at her then. In the evening light his eyes were the dark, direct brown she had memorized over the preceding days without meaning to. "I would like to call on you properly," he said. "If you are willing." She held his gaze. "I am willing," she said. Something in his face relaxed, not dramatically. He was not a dramatic man, but a particular tension that she recognized in retrospect had been there all along eased out of his jaw and his shoulders, and she felt her own shoulders come down a degree. "Good," he said. "Then I will call on you tomorrow." "I will be at Daniel's in the morning," she said. "And in the afternoon?" he asked. "Free," she said. He nodded, and they stood by the river a while longer in the cottonwood-scented evening air, and she was acutely and happily aware of every inch of the small distance between them. He called on her the next afternoon at 4 o'clock, arriving at her boarding house with his hat in his hand, and a small bunch of prairie wildflowers that he had clearly gathered himself rather than purchased, yellow and white and slightly wilted from the heat but genuinely mint, which made them better than hothouse flowers would have been. He handed them to her with a directness that made her laugh a little, not at him, but with the simple pleasure of it. "I know they are not much," he said. "They are exactly right," she told him, and put them in the water glass on her windowsill, where they recovered somewhat and brightened the room considerably. They walked in the afternoon, out along the river road south of town, where it was quiet, and the only sounds were the wind and the distant lowing of cattle and the birds in the cottonwoods. They talked about everything and nothing, the comfortable range of two people who are not yet running out of things to say, and who already know that the territory of each other's minds is interesting enough to sustain any length of exploration. He told her about the years on the trail, the heat and the cold and the long months in the saddle, the cattle stampedes that happened without warning and the river crossings that were dangerous in ways that were difficult to fully describe, the particular beauty of the plains at dawn, when the light came up over an ocean of grass, and the sky went from black to every shade of color in the space of an hour. She told him about the years in St. Joseph, the small independence of her dressmaking work, the satisfactions of it, the social world of women who worked for themselves and who had created a kind of network that looked informal from the outside, but was in fact a sophisticated web of mutual support. She told him about her friend Lydia Marsh, who ran a millinery shop and who was the sharpest business mind Irene had ever encountered in any gender, and about her friend Ruth Bowen, who had taught herself accounting and kept books for half a dozen front street businesses. She told him about the city as it was changing, growing, becoming something bigger and more complicated than the frontier town it had once been, and about the strange feeling of watching a place you knew well transform into a place that was both familiar and foreign. "Do you want to go back to St. Joseph?" he asked, and there was nothing loaded in the question. He was simply asking. "I want to know that Daniel is well," she said. "After that, I'm not certain what I want." "That is honest," he said. "I try to be," she said, and looked at him sideways, and he was already looking at her, and they both looked away in the same moment, like two people who have nearly said something aloud that they are not quite ready to say, and who have decided wordlessly to give it a little more time. The weeks passed in Dodge City with a texture and richness that Irene had not expected from what was ostensibly a waiting period before her real life resumed. Daniel improved steadily, each day stronger than the one before, and by the third week he was out of bed and moving around the house, and by the fourth he was sitting in the kitchen garden in a chair for several hours at a stretch, letting the sun work on the pallor that 6 months of illness had put into his skin. He ate well and slept well, and the doctor who came twice a week pronounced himself satisfied with the progress. Ralph started his work at the Bramley Ranch on the schedule he had planned, riding out to the spread 12 miles northwest of Dodge City early each Monday morning, and coming back into town on Saturday afternoons for supplies and for her, not always in that order, which was a fact she did not share with anyone except Daniel, who already knew. On Saturday evenings, they would have supper together at the Dodge House, or at a small restaurant on 2nd Street that served a reliable beef stew and an exceptional apple pie, and they would walk afterward when the evenings were cool enough. He was demonstrably and increasingly attentive in the particular way of someone who has decided what they want and is no longer equivocating about it, but who is moving at a pace that she could match, which she appreciated enormously. There was a moment in the 4th week, she would remember it precisely for years afterward, when they were sitting on the bench in the cottonwood grove by the river in the late afternoon, and she was talking about a dress she had seen in the general store window, a practical cotton in a particular shade of blue that she was considering, and she turned in the middle of describing it to look at him, and he was not looking at the store or the dress or anything at all except her. With an expression so full of undisguised warmth and wanting that she lost the thread of what she was saying entirely. "Ralph," she said. "Yes," he said, and his voice was a little rougher than usual. She was 30 seconds from saying something that would change everything, and she knew it, and she did not pull back from it. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her hand, which was resting on the bench between them, and held it in both of his, and looked down at it as though he was carefully memorizing the look of her hand in his. "I am thinking," he said, "that I came to Dodge City to take a job and build something stable, and that I have found something I did not expect to find, and that I would be a considerable fool to pretend I have not found it." Her heart was doing something complicated and entirely beyond her direction. "What have you found?" she asked. He looked up at her. "You, Irene," he said simply. "I have found you." She looked at him for a long, clear moment, and everything she felt was on her face, and she did not hide it because she had made a decision somewhere along the weeks of Dodge City evenings that she was not going to hide things from this man. "I am glad you sat down in that depot," she said. "So am I," he said. "More than I can say." He lifted her hand and pressed his lips to it, brief and certain, and she felt the warmth of it all the way through her. They talked for another hour by the river, and by the time they walked back toward town, the conversation had moved to things that were both enormous and practical, the way such conversations do when two people who are serious about each other begin to let the seriousness become explicit. He spoke about the Bramley Ranch, about the fact that the job offered a house small but proper, a 3-room cabin on the property provided to the trail boss as part of the arrangement, and about the fact that he had been putting his wages carefully aside with a specific purpose in mind. She spoke about her work in St. Joseph and about the question of whether that work could be carried on in Dodge City or somewhere nearby, and about the needs of a woman who valued her own competence and her own contribution. He listened to all of it with complete attention. "I would not want a woman who did not work," he said. "A woman who uses her mind is not competition for a man. She is the better half of a life." She stopped walking. She turned to look at him in the street. "Ralph Holloway," she said. "Where exactly did you come from?" He raised an eyebrow. "San Antonio, Texas," he said. "I mentioned this." "You know what I mean," she said. He smiled, and it was the real smile, the one she had been seeing more of as the weeks went on, broad and unguarded and completely transforming of his weathered face. "I had a good mother," he said, "and I have been paying attention." She went back to Daniel that evening and told him everything, which took 2 hours because Daniel wanted the details, and because she discovered, in the course of telling them, that there were a great many details that mattered more to her than she had realized until she was giving them a voice. Daniel listened without interrupting, which was remarkable self-discipline for a man who had strong opinions, and when she finished he said, "Has he said anything specific about his intentions?" "Not in those words," she said, "but the words have been coming closer together." "And what do you want?" Daniel asked. She thought about the question with the care it deserved. "I want to stay," she said. "I want to see where this goes, and I do not think I need to go back to St. Joseph to do that." "Your work," he said. "There are women in Dodge City who need dresses made," she said. "And with the cattle money coming through, there is more demand for good dressmaking than you might expect. Mrs. Kenyon already asked if I did alterations." Daniel looked at her for a long time with an expression that was more complex than his usual clear-eyed assessments. There was something old in it, something from the years they had spent keeping each other steady when steadiness was hard, and she recognized it as the look of a brother who has been watching over a sister and is about to put down the watching, not because it is no longer wanted, but because it is no longer needed. "You look like yourself," he said. "You said that before," she said softly. "It bears repeating," he said. "It is a good thing to see." She hugged him carefully, mindful of how much weight he had still not regained, and he hugged her back with more strength than she expected. 3 days later, on a Tuesday evening when he had ridden back into town unexpectedly to get a piece of tack repaired at the blacksmith's shop, Ralph found her at the river in the cottonwood grove where she had taken to going in the evenings, and he stood in front of her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not uncertain exactly, but clearly working through something he had decided to say and was moving toward with determination. "Irene," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring. It was not elaborate, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone set in it, the stone the blue of a Kansas sky in October, and he held it out to her in his palm. "I am asking this plainly," he said, "because it is the only way I know how to ask it. Will you marry me? I have a cabin at the Bramley Ranch that is small but can be made into a home, and I have a position that is stable, and I have been certain of how I feel about you for longer than you might expect. I would like to build a life alongside you, Irene, if you are willing." She looked at the ring in his palm and then at his face, and the face was open and serious and completely without guile, the face of the man she had come to know over weeks of conversations and shared evenings and the particular intimacy of honest company. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Ralph, I will marry you." The smile that broke across his face in that moment was the broadest and most unguarded she had ever seen from him, and he put the ring on her finger with hands that were entirely steady, which she thought was characteristic and right, and then she took his face in both her hands and kissed him, which was not proper in 1878 by the standards of polite society, but which was entirely proper by the standards of two people standing in Cottonwood light by a Kansas river, having just agreed to spend their lives together. He kissed her back with a warmth and sureness that told her everything she needed to know about what lay on the other side of this moment. They told Daniel that evening. Daniel sat in his garden chair in the last of the daylight with his hands folded on his knee and listened while Irene talked, and then he looked at Ralph for a long, measuring moment with the eyes of a brother who has been the nearest thing to a father his sister has known. "You will take care of her," Daniel said. It was not precisely a question. "We will take care of each other," Ralph said. "She is not a woman who needs taking care of by a man. But I will be there for whatever she needs for as long as I am able." Daniel was quiet for another moment, and then he put out his hand and Ralph shook it, and Daniel said, "Then welcome to the family, Ralph Holloway." They were married in Dodge City 6 weeks after Ralph's proposal, in the small Methodist church on Spruce Street, on a Saturday morning in October, when the Kansas air had turned crisp, and the cottonwood leaves were coming down in bright yellow drifts along the riverbank. The ceremony was simple and genuine. A minister who had been in Dodge City long enough to have lost any tendency toward performance, 2 witnesses in the persons of Daniel Ford and Aldous Bramley, who turned out to be a straightforward man with kind eyes and an obvious respect for the man he had hired as his trail boss, and Clara Ames, who had found her footing in Dodge City with remarkable speed and was working as a bookkeeper for a Front Street merchant, and who came to the wedding with red eyes that she claimed were from the wind. Irene wore the blue cotton dress she had bought in Dodge City, the particular shade she had been describing when Ralph had looked at her with that unguarded expression by the river. She had altered it herself, spending 3 evenings on the work, and it fit her perfectly. She carried a small bunch of late-season prairie flowers that Ralph had brought that morning, wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from his bandana. She stood beside him at the front of the small church and listened to the words of the ceremony with her whole attention, because she was the kind of woman who listened to things rather than simply being present for them, and because every word mattered. When the minister asked her if she took Ralph Holloway to be her husband, to love and to honor in the life they had chosen, she said yes in a clear, unhesitating voice that carried to the back of the church, and she felt him standing beside her like something solid and true, something she had not known she was waiting for, until she found it on a hard wooden bench in a depot in Caldwell, Kansas, at 7:30 in the evening on a summer day. The ring was already on her finger, the turquoise stone catching the October light through the church windows, small and honest and entirely hers. After the ceremony, they had a small celebration at the Dodge House, which Bramley had arranged with the particular generosity of a man who appreciated his trail boss and wanted to mark the occasion properly. There was good food and good coffee, and the kind of conversation that flows easily among people who are genuinely happy about what is happening. Daniel ate more than he had at any single meal in Irene's memory, which she took as the most reliable indicator of his recovery, and he made a toast that was brief and true, and that made her cry a little, which she had not planned to do, pressing her fingers to her eyes and laughing at the same time. Ralph's hand was warm on her back throughout the afternoon, not possessive but present, the hand of a man who was there, and intended to remain there. The cabin on the Bramley Ranch, 12 miles northwest of Dodge City, was precisely what Ralph had described: small but proper. 3 rooms of rough-hewn timber with a stone fireplace in the main room and a cast-iron stove in the kitchen, and windows that looked out over prairie in 3 directions, and from the kitchen to the ranch buildings where the work happened. It was not elegant, but it was real. Irene looked at it for the first time on the afternoon they moved her things from the boarding house, and she stood in the main room and turned slowly, taking inventory of what was there and what needed to be done. And in the 2 weeks after the wedding, she made it into something that was genuinely a home. She put curtains at the windows that she had cut and sewn herself, and she organized the kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who had been running a household since 14. And she planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the cabin before the first frost closed the ground, knowing it was late in the season, but wanting the earth turned and ready for spring. Ralph watched her work with an expression that she caught occasionally when she turned around, that same undisguised warmth she had seen in him by the river, intensified now by proximity and dailiness, by the fact of waking up in the same house and eating at the same table and sitting by the same fire in the evenings. He worked hard. She had known he would from the way he talked about work, but seeing it was different from knowing it up before dawn, out to the cattle and the ranch in all weather, home in the evening with the particular tiredness of a man who had done a full day of hard physical work, and who sat down at the supper table with genuine gratitude for the food and the warmth and the company. They fell into the patterns of shared domestic life with a compatibility that neither of them took for granted, because both of them were old enough and had been alone long enough to know that compatibility was not a given. They talked. They had always been good at talking, from the first evening in the depot, and that did not change. In the evenings by the fire they talked about the ranch and about Dodge City and about Daniel, who was by the end of October fully on his feet and back at his work at Calloway's dry goods store. They talked about the country, about the cattle trade, and about the increasing pressure on the Plains tribes as the railroads pushed west and the buffalo herds diminished, a dispossession that was playing out with systematic injustice that neither Ralph nor Irene could entirely ignore even in the daily business of their own lives, and which they discussed with the frank moral seriousness it deserved. Ralph had worked with Comanche men on cattle drives, had respected them as working partners, and he had no interest in the kinds of casual dehumanization that were common currency in the saloons and newspapers of the era. They talked about the future, about what they wanted to build, about the land. In the early spring of 1879, Irene discovered she was pregnant, a discovery that came on a Tuesday morning in late March when she had been sick 3 days running, and when the accumulating evidence finally organized itself into a single, clear fact. She sat in the kitchen for a while with a cup of tea and let the knowledge settle through her, and felt it land somewhere deep and true as something that was both new and entirely right. She told Ralph that evening at supper. She put down her fork and looked at him and said, "I am going to have a baby." He put down his fork too and looked at her, and she watched the understanding move through him like light through water. And then he was out of his chair and he came around the table and he pulled her to her feet and held her, simply held her with both arms and his whole attention, and she felt his breathing change against her hair. "Irene," he said. "Are you glad?" she asked. "I am so glad," he said, and his voice was rough. "I am so glad I do not have the words for it." She pressed her face against his shoulder and felt the truth of that, the depth of it, and was glad herself in the wordless way he described, in the way that went past speech and resided somewhere simpler and older. Daniel came for supper the following Sunday and cried openly when they told him, which was unprecedented, and which he blamed on his period of illness having weakened his constitution, and which neither Irene nor Ralph believed for a moment. The pregnancy was hard in the early months, with a persistent nausea that she dealt with by applying her characteristic practicality to the management of it: crackers kept by the bed, careful choices about what she ate. And when? The quiet insistence that she was going to continue her dressmaking work for as long as she was able, because she was not an invalid and the work was important to her, and because 3 women in Dodge City were already counting on her for their spring wardrobes. Ralph worried about her in a way that was attentive without being smothering, which was the exact right calibration. He rode in from the ranch every day, which was not always convenient, and which he did without being asked because that was the kind of man he was, and he was honest about his worry when she asked him directly. "I worry that something will go wrong," he said one evening plainly. "I worry the way I worry about a river crossing. I know most of the time it goes well, and I know that worry itself does not prevent the thing from going wrong. So I try to watch the water and be ready." "That is very sensible," she said. "It does not feel sensible," he said. "It feels like watching someone I love more than anything I have ever loved cross a river that I cannot cross with her." She reached across the table and put her hand on his. "I am a good swimmer," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers, and that was enough. The baby came in late November of 1879, a boy, born in the cabin in a first frost that had turned the prairie silver outside the windows, with the assistance of a midwife from Dodge City, named Mrs. Garrard, who had delivered more babies in that part of Kansas than she could easily count, and who did everything with a calm, unhurried competence that Irene found deeply reassuring during the hours of labor. Ralph sat in the outer room during the worst of it, which was where Mrs. Garrard firmly put him, and Irene could hear him moving intermittently, back and forth, the measured pacing of a man exercising every available unit of his self-discipline. When Mrs. Garrard opened the door and told him he could come in, he came so quickly that he was almost undignified about it, which was entirely unlike him, and which she found endearing beyond her ability to describe. Their son was small and dark-haired and entirely healthy, with lungs that Mrs. Garrard reported as notably vigorous, which was a professional assessment confirmed by the sound of them over the subsequent hours. Ralph sat in the chair beside the bed and held his son with the kind of concentrated care of a man holding something that matters so much that the ordinary world has temporarily ceased to exist, and he looked at Irene over the baby's head with eyes that said everything he had ever said and more besides. "What shall we call him?" Irene asked. He thought about it seriously as he thought about everything. "James," he said, "after my father." "James," she said, trying it. "James Holloway." She paused. "Daniel would like to be his middle name." "James Daniel Holloway," Ralph said, and looked down at his son, who had gone to sleep with the entire-bodied contentment of a newborn who has been warm and fed and held. "Yes, that is right." Daniel came 2 days later and spent an hour in the chair by the bed with his nephew, who appeared to regard him with the calm disinterest of someone who had recently arrived from somewhere else and had not yet formed opinions about the local population. Daniel, who had never struck Irene as particularly sentimental, sat with the baby in his arms and said almost nothing for the whole hour, just looked. "He looks like both of you," he said eventually. "He looks like himself," Ralph said from the doorway. Daniel looked up at his brother-in-law with that assessing look he had turned on Ralph at the garden on the day of the engagement, and then he smiled, the real smile, the one Irene had known all her life, the one that was their father's smile and that she had been afraid, through the worst of his illness, she might not see again. "Yes," Daniel said, "he does." Winter on the Bramley Ranch was a lesson in the particular demands of the Kansas plains in the cold months, which were considerable. The wind came out of the north with a brutality that was different in character from anything Irene had experienced in Missouri. A flat, unbroken, serious cold that filled every gap in every wall and required constant management of the stove and the fireplace. She had James bundled in everything she had made and knitted over the summer months, and she learned the ranch's seasonal rhythms alongside her husband, learning which work could not be delayed and which could be set aside for a warmer day, learning the names of the ranch hands and their qualities and the particular dynamics of a working cattle operation in all its seasons. Ralph was extraordinary at his work. She had sensed this from his quiet confidence in describing it, but seeing it was different and better, as seeing things always was. He managed men well, with the same straightforward respect he brought to every interaction, and the cowboys on the Bramley spread worked well for him because he was fair, and because he knew what he was doing, and because he did not ask anything of anyone that he would not do himself. Aldous Bramley told Irene at a Sunday supper in the big house that hiring Ralph Holloway was the best decision he had made in 15 years of cattle ranching, and said it with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of a man stating an observed fact rather than offering a compliment. By the time James was 6 months old, Irene had resumed her dressmaking work 3 mornings a week, with James settled in a basket near her sewing table with the comprehensive contentment of a baby who was well-fed and secure, and fascinated by the world at the level of about 18 inches from the floor. She had 4 regular clients in Dodge City and 2 more on nearby ranches, and the work gave her not only income, but the particular satisfaction of doing something well that she had always done well, and of remaining herself in the midst of all the ways she had changed. Ralph brought home a dog in the spring of 1880. A large and disreputable shepherd mix named Grant who had attached himself to a cattle drive and refused to leave, and who appointed himself James's personal guardian with a seriousness that was both touching and occasionally inconvenient. Grant slept outside James's door and regarded anyone who approached the baby with an assessment that was not threatening but was entirely thorough, and Irene decided within a week that she loved the dog completely. Daniel recovered his full health by the following spring and married his landlady's niece, a capable young woman named Violet who had grown up in Dodge City and who had, it turned out, been bringing Daniel soup during the worst of his illness for reasons that she admitted, when pressed, had not been entirely charitable in their motivation. Irene liked her immediately, which was important, and the 4 of them, Ralph and Irene, Daniel and Violet, fell into an easy social life of Sunday suppers and shared occasions that felt like the family none of them had quite managed to fully have on their own. Clara Ames, the young woman from the train who had been traveling to meet a man who died before she got there, married the Front Street merchant she had come to keep books for, a steady, humor-burdened widower named Henry Pratt who was 15 years her senior, and who treated her with a consideration that was obvious to anyone who saw them together. Irene sat at her wedding in the spring of 1881 and thought about the train and the weeping woman and the conversation about practical options, and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with her own life and everything to do with the simple fact that things could go right. James turned 1 in November of 1880, and then 2, and then 3, a loud and cheerful and entirely himself child who had his father's steady temperament, and his mother's dark eyes, and his Uncle Daniel's inexhaustible curiosity about how everything worked and why. He learned to walk on the cabin's wooden floor, and then immediately applied his new skill to reaching every surface that Irene had previously considered out of reach, and Ralph watched him with an expression of constant affectionate amusement, and caught him regularly from the tops of furniture with the reflex speed of a man accustomed to quick physical responses. In the autumn of 1882, Irene told Ralph she was pregnant again. This time she told him at the breakfast table rather than at supper, because she was not in the habit of waiting when she had something to say, and he looked at her across the table with James between them in his chair eating porridge with the aggressive inaccuracy of a 3-year-old, and his face was everything she had learned to love, open and warm and entirely present. "Are you glad?" she asked, for the second time. "Every single time you will ever ask me that question," he said, "the answer will be yes." The second child was a girl, born in the summer of 1883, dark-haired like her brother and her father, with her mother's stubborn chin already visible in the determined set of her small face. They named her Ellen, after Ralph's mother, with the middle name Rose for no reason except that it suited her, and she had arrived in June when the wild roses were blooming in thick pink abundance along the creek south of the cabin. James, now 3 and possessed of strong opinions about the newcomer, alternated between regarding Ellen with intense suspicion and regarding her with a protective intensity that was one of the more charming things Irene had seen in her life. Within a week he had declared himself her official guardian, a role he shared reluctantly with Grant the dog, and he was found on more than one occasion sitting beside her basket simply looking at her with the focused, serious attention of someone taking charge of an important responsibility. "He will be good to her," Ralph said, watching them one evening from the doorway. "He will be insufferable to her," Irene said, "and she will love every minute of it." She was right on both counts. The Bramley Ranch grew through the early 1880s. Aldous Bramley expanding his operation into new grazing territory and adding cattle to his herds with the steady confidence of a man who knew the business. Ralph managed the growth with the same quiet competence he had brought to everything, and by 1884 the Bramley operation was one of the more substantial in that part of Kansas, with a reputation for well-managed cattle and well-treated hands that was remarked upon in Dodge City with some frequency. Ralph received other offers in those years, offers from other ranches, some of them more lucrative, one of them from a large operation in Colorado Territory that would have meant a significant increase in wages, but also a relocation and a break in the life they had built. He brought the offers home and laid them on the table honestly, as he laid everything on the table, and they discussed them, as they discussed everything, with the directness that had been the hallmark of their conversation from a depot bench in Caldwell, Kansas, to the breakfast table of a 3-room cabin on the Kansas plains. They stayed. The life they had built was real and it was theirs, and no amount of additional wages was worth the unbuilding of it. Irene's dressmaking business continued to grow along with the community. By 1884, she had a proper workroom built onto the north side of the cabin, with good light from a large window and space enough for a proper cutting table and her 2 sewing machines. She had purchased a second by then, a reliable treadle model that she used for the heavier work while keeping the older one for the finer pieces. She employed 2 women part-time, wives of ranch hands whose needle skills were good and who welcomed the work and the income, and she paid them fairly, which was both the right thing to do and the practical thing, because women who were paid fairly came back and did their best work. Daniel's dry goods business prospered with him, and he and Violet had their first child in 1883, a boy they named Thomas, who had Violet's fair coloring and Daniel's already evident stubbornness, and who grew up as James and Ellen's closest cousin and playmate in the years that followed. The cattle drive that Ralph had taken as the last of the major long trail runs came in the spring of 1885, a drive up from the southern part of the territory to the northern grazing lands that Bramley was developing, and it was during those weeks that Irene managed the cabin and the children, and the workroom with a self-sufficiency that was entirely natural to her, and that she had never questioned. Ralph came home with trail dust ground into everything he owned and a tiredness that was deep in the bone, and she had a bath prepared and food on the table and both children asleep by the time he walked through the door, and she looked at him in the lamplight, trail-worn and present, and felt the same thing she had felt on the bench in the depot when he sat down beside her, the clean, certain feeling of something that was right. He came to the table and looked at the food and at her and at the sleeping quiet of the house, and he sat down heavily in his chair and looked across the table at her. "I missed you every single day," he said, "more than last time. I think it gets worse rather than better." "Good," she said, and sat down across from him. "Eat your supper." He ate, and she watched him, and they talked, and the fire burned down slowly in the grate, and outside the Kansas night was vast and full of stars, the same stars that had been there when he sat down beside her 7 years ago in a depot where she had been waiting 6 hours for a train that had not come. In the autumn of 1885, on a Sunday afternoon when the cottonwoods along the river road were going gold, and the air had that particular clean cold that signaled the approach of winter, Ralph and Irene drove the wagon into Dodge City for Daniel's Sunday supper, as they did most weeks. James was 6, sitting in the wagon bed with the focused attention of a child who is taking in everything, and Ellen was 2, sitting on Irene's lap and gripping the front of her coat with small, competent hands. The town was quieter than it had been at its cattle drive peak, the great years of the Kisham Trail coming to an end as the railroads pushed further south, and the cattle could be shipped from Texas directly, bypassing the long drives north. Dodge City was changing, becoming something other than a cattle town, settling into a different identity that was less loud and less dangerous and perhaps less vivid, but also more stable, more livable, more given to the building of things that lasted. They sat around Daniel's dining table, all of them, Ralph and Irene, Daniel and Violet with Thomas and Mrs. Kenyon, who had become a kind of honorary aunt to the family in the years since Irene had first knocked on her door with a sick brother and a carpet bag. There was a great deal of food and a great deal of noise, as there always was when this particular gathering assembled, and James organized Thomas into some elaborate game in the parlor that resulted in a crash of uncertain origin that both their parents decided to attribute to the wind. After supper, Ralph and Irene sat on Daniel's front porch while the children were put to bed inside, and the evening came down blue and cold and clear over Dodge City, and the familiar smell of the plains was in the air, grass and cold and distance, the smell of a country that was still enormous even when the front porch of a house gave it a human scale. "Do you remember," Irene said, "a Tuesday evening in August in 1878, sitting in a depot in Caldwell, waiting for a train that was running 6 hours late?" Ralph was quiet for a moment beside her, and she could feel the smile in him before she saw it. "I remember," he said. "What made you sit down?" she said. "You could have gone to the boarding house directly. You could have gone to the saloon, but you came to the depot and you sat down and said you would wait." He was quiet for a moment longer. The stars were coming out in the first dark sky, scattered and bright, the same extravagant abundance she had seen from Mrs. Milligan's porch 7 years ago. "I saw you from the street," he said, "through the depot window. You were sitting alone and you had been there for hours. You could tell from the look of you, and you were holding a letter in your hands, and you were not crying even though you plainly wanted to, and you had your chin up, and I thought." He paused. "What did you think?" she asked. "I thought that I had never seen anything that looked so much like courage," he said, "and I thought that courage like that should not have to wait alone." She turned to look at him in the evening dark, this man who had walked into a depot and sat down and said he would wait, this man who had offered her a peppermint stick and said what he meant and married her in a blue dress by a cottonwood river, and held their children with hands that had driven cattle across 1,000 miles of open country, and she felt the whole weight and warmth of the 7 years between that depot bench and this front porch, all of it. The love and the work and the children and the arguments they had resolved and the seasons they had lived through and the life they had built, plain and real and entirely theirs. "Ralph," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad you sat down," she said. He reached over in the dark and took her hand, the same hand he had taken on a river bench when he told her what he had found, and held it between both of his the way he had always held it, with a warmth that was both ordinary and infinite, the warmth of a man who had found where he was going to wake up in the morning and intended to be grateful for it every single day. "So am I," he said, "more than I will ever have the words for." Above them the Kansas sky went fully dark, and the stars came out in force, filling the enormous vault of the prairie night with their cold, extravagant light. The same sky that had witnessed cattle drives and railroad lines, and the unmappable movements of human lives across the wide plains. And in the warm yellow light that fell through Daniel's windows behind them, the sound of children's voices drifted out into the night, and a dog barked somewhere on the edge of town. And the cottonwood trees along the river made their soft, constant sound in the evening wind. Irene Ford, who had once waited 6 hours alone on a hard wooden bench in a depot in Caldwell, Kansas, sat in the autumn dark on her brother's front porch with her husband's hand warm around hers, and her children asleep inside a house that smelled like supper and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of family. And she was, in all the plain and ordinary and extraordinary ways that a life can make a person entirely and completely happy. And Ralph Holloway, who had been moving since he was 17 and who had wanted, more than he had let himself say aloud for a very long time, to know where he was going to wake up in the morning, sat beside his wife under a sky that he had watched from 1,000 different points across the open country, and felt, in the same plain and complete way that he did everything precisely where he was, and precisely what he had, and precisely how much it meant. The train from Caldwell was long since arrived. They were exactly where they were supposed to be.